Hi everyone, I'm Cynthia Treen, and welcome to my channel.
In this video, we'll cover the basic techniques needed to hand stitch my felt animal designs. I'll expand on these in subsequent videos, but if you're a beginner, this is a great place to start. And if you're a seasoned stitcher, there might be nuances that you'll love too. Let's start at the very beginning by choosing a great needle. Not every needle is created with the same precision, so if you struggle with threading, having a well-made needle can be a game changer. I use John James needles in my kits, but Bowen needles are equally good. That said, the best I've ever used are tulip needles. If I could buy these in bulk, I would use them in my kits. They're made in Hiroshima, Japan to exacting standards, and their surfaces are polished with microscopic striations to reduce drag, which makes for a fabulously smooth sewing experience. They have large, easy-to-thread eyes that are gold-plated and have been polished to remove burrs that weaken thread. If you've not tried these needles, I highly recommend them. I usually stitch with a number 8, but 9 and 10 are extra fine and wonderful to use. Number 7, which in other brands can be too large, is still smooth to stitch with in the tulip needles, and a great alternative if you need an extra large eye. I've noticed I experience less tangling and breakage with shorter thread, so I like to stitch with lengths of about 20 inches. To thread a needle, there are a couple of tricks you can try. The first one works like this. Begin by wetting the end and giving it a clean cut. Pinch the end of the thread between your thumb and index fingers and draw it down with your last 3 fingers, so you can barely see the cut end. At this point, you can fill the eye with liquid by putting it in your mouth or in a dish of water. With liquid in the eye, when you press it down over the thread, and open your fingers a bit as you do, rather than the fibers wanting to splay apart as usual, the thread will wick up the water and slide through the needle more readily. Another method is using tailor's wax to stiffen and smooth the thread end. Coat the thread end with wax and pull it through your fingers to flatten and smooth it. The end should now stand up on its own, and like the previous technique, the fibers will not splay apart as you thread your needle. To make a starting knot, begin with a threaded needle. Hold the cut end in your left hand and the needle in your right. Place the cut end on your index finger, then clamp down with the shaft of the needle. Make 3 to 4 wraps around the needle's shaft. Some people are coordinated enough to bring their thumb up and pinch the thread, but I have a hard time with that. So I slide the needle off onto my left index finger and press with my thumb, and then I can push the needle up through those wraps to create a tidy, organized knot. With a single strand of floss, I typically make 3 to 4 wraps to get the ideal knot size for felt, but you can adjust the size to make more or less wraps depending on what you need. With wool and wool blend felt, a 1/16 of an inch seam allowance is the perfect depth. If we put a 6-inch ruler up to this, you can see what that looks like. In metric, it would be about 1.5 millimeters. We'll talk more about this in a minute. A whip stitch wraps around the edge of a seam, binding the 2 layers together. Although it's a basic stitch, there are a few tricks to making it strong and even. Let's give it a closer look. I hold the fabric in my left hand and gently pinch it between my index and middle finger and my thumb and ring finger. Or, if the piece I'm stitching is small, I'll hold it between my thumb and my middle finger. This gives me control of the immediate area where I'm stitching. It's worth noting that I stitch out from my body rather than towards me, which keeps the thread out of the way as I stitch. For beginners, this holding position allows you to tilt from side to side so you can see both your entry and exit and make sure you've caught equal depths of felt on each side. If your needle goes in at an angle, catching less of the felt on one side, you're bound to have a weak point. So keep an eye on this as you stitch, especially where seams will be stressed by stuffing. With a bit of practice, you'll get the feel for how far to hold your thumb and ring finger away from the seam edge. I use the surface of my ring finger as a guide for the needle's entry. I make fine adjustments to my stitch depth and see where it enters and exits the fabric. As I draw the loop in, I pinch over the thread's entry and exit again, which forces it to come down perpendicular to the seam rather than tilting forwards or back. And finally, after the stitch loop reaches the seam, I give it an extra pull to sink it snugly around the edge. One more trick for spacing. This tip was shared by one of my makers, and I love to pass it along. Use a ruler and a fine tip pen to mark your thumb in 1/16 inch increments, and use these to help you space your stitches evenly. Before making my ending knot, I like to do 2 or 3 whip stitches on top of each other for extra strength. If the seam I'm mending will intersect with another seam, for example, head darts intersecting with a center head seam, I like to set back the ending knot from the edge so my needle won't catch it later on. Ending knots are overhand knots. For a secure ending knot, you'll want to make it right up against the fabric. Here are 2 tricks to do that. As you can see, I've secured my piece to the table with pins. I don't do this when stitching, but I want it to stay put for the clarity of this process. Make a loop and bring your needle up through it. With your right hand, pinch the needle at the eye, securing the thread from slipping. With your left hand, insert your thumb and middle finger into the loop, leaving your index finger free. Draw open your thumb and middle fingers while pulling outward with your hands to bring the loop crossing down to the felt surface. Put your index finger on the crossing. Release your thumb and middle fingers, then tighten the knot. Repeat this 2 to 3 times for a secure finish to your seam. Here is another version of the same knot. This is the one I use. For me, it flows better, but may seem awkward until you get the hang of it. But I hope you'll give it a try, because once you do, it's faster and smoother, and I think you'll love it. Okay, let me slow that down and explain. With your right hand, pinch the needle between your thumb and middle finger, or index finger, and lift it vertically from the table. Pivot your left wrist so the thumb is facing down, orienting your hand to the right side of the thread. Clasp the thread with all your fingers while turning your wrist and hand upward to create a loop. Pass the needle to your left hand, pinching it between your thumb and index fingers. Then transfer the loop to the last 3 fingers of your right hand. As you do, pinch the needle and thread securely with your left so the thread doesn't slip through the needle's eye. Open the 3 fingers of your right hand while pulling with your left to draw the crossing down to the felt surface. Use your index finger or your thumb to reach over and press on the crossing, then pull the thread to form the knot. Knowing when, where, and how to hide knots will give your creation a more polished finish. Here are a few basics to get you started. Order of operations or the slimness of a shape might make it preferable to leave a seam visible. When that's the case, make starting knots between the layers. In this example of my frog prints, his narrow wrists, ankles, and fingers made visible whip stitching the best option. For him, starting knots were hidden between the seam layers throughout. Because visible stitching works best for their assembly, it's the same situation with the starting knots on the basic bodies of otter, badger, and many of my other animal designs. One of the many perks of stitching felt is that its edges don't fray, as woven fabrics do, allowing you to stitch seams on the outside. That being said, over the years I've refined my techniques and now choose to turn certain seams inside for nearly an invisible finish. I do this on the fronts of heads and faces, and on the most visible seams of clothing. Because these seams will eventually be turned, knots can be left on the stitching side, rather than hiding them between layers. As we assemble and stuff our felt creations, they go from being flat to three-dimensional. So in a moment, I'll show you how to hide the ending knots on stuffed shapes. But before we do, let's take a slight detour to look more closely at the stitch I'm working on right now, because it's a sneak peek into our next techniques video. To finesse perfect patch placement, sometimes it makes sense to attach them after stuffing. This process used to prove a challenge before I came up with the idea of blending stitches. This one is sort of a mashup with the resulting appearance of an appliqued whip stitch. I coined the term hybrid to describe these blends. This one is a hybrid whip stitch because when complete, it looks like an appliqued whip stitch, but secretly blends the whip and the blind stitch together and makes appliquing patches to 3D objects a breeze no matter their shape. This stitch also works well for adding bellies and paw patches after stuffing. 1. Begin by securing the starting knot beneath the patch. Then bring the needle up through the patch about 1/16 inch from its edge. 2. Pass the needle a short distance forward through the head's surface, parallel to the patch edge. This move is much like the blind or ladder stitch. 3. Coming from the opposite direction, slip the needle beneath the edge of the patch and bring it up through the edge as before. By accessing the edge from a backward angle, you can circumvent most obstacles, like the nose on this head. I also love this technique for the assembly of my basic body. It gracefully navigates around the legs and arms without obstruction. Well, I hope you like that stitch as much as I do. We'll cover more stitch varieties in our next techniques tutorial. Now, back to our scheduled programming. Let's finish up that ending knot so you can get started on your next project. After making your ending knots, pull the thread taut to access the hole it came through. Then slip the needle through the hole behind the knot and into the 3D form, exiting a little ways away. Give the thread a tug to pop the knot through the hole, hiding it below the surface. If the process leaves a mark, scratch over it gently with your needle. This action will lift nearby fibers to hide any evidence. Okay folks, that's it for today. Stay tuned for more felt stitching techniques and tutorials. If you like this video, you know what to do and how to follow. If you'd like to visit my Etsy shop, join my Patreon group, or support my tutorials with a one-time tip on Buy Me a Coffee, you'll find links to those and all my socials in the post via my Linktree. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, happy stitching!